The sky above Pine Valley churned with thick, rolling clouds, heavy with the promise of rain. The air was damp, thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, as if the land itself was mourning alongside the gathered crowd. Eleanor Matthews was gone. A woman who had once filled classrooms with warmth and knowledge now lay beneath a casket polished to a deep, sorrowful sheen, reflecting the dim light of the approaching storm. People stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the wilderness, their figures dark silhouettes against the overcast sky. The funeral was held in the small cemetery just outside town, a place where the gravestones were crooked with age, where names from generations past had faded into illegibility. Eleanor would now rest among them, her presence reduced to a name on stone, another voice lost to time. Despite the gathering storm, no one moved. No one spoke. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the dry branches like brittle bones. The funeral attendees, students, colleagues, and townsfolk, stood in uneasy silence, their faces drawn, not only by sorrow but by something deeper, something unspoken. The respect they held for Eleanor Matthews was undeniable, but beneath that respect lay guilt, shame, and the weight of unvoiced regrets. Many of them owed her more than they had ever admitted, and now, standing in the cold, their breath visible in the air, there was nothing left to do but pretend they had always been grateful. Near the front stood Margaret Ellis, her aging hands clutching a damp tissue. She had been one of Eleanor's earliest students, now an elderly woman herself, with her own children grown and moved away. Her lips trembled as she stared at the casket, but she did not cry. She had been cruel to Eleanor as a child, mocking her strictness, resenting her discipline. Now, the years had twisted that childish defiance into something unbearable, something that clawed at her throat as she tried to breathe past the weight of remorse. A few paces behind Margaret stood Daniel Whitaker, once an arrogant teenager who had barely graduated under Eleanor's relentless push. He had never thanked her. Instead, he had rolled his eyes behind her back, laughed at her insistence on discipline, and ignored her when she offered him extra help. Now, as a successful businessman, he had told himself he would visit her one day, tell her that she had been right, that he had learned. But he had never come. He had been too busy. Now, his expensive shoes sank slightly into the wet ground, mud clinging to the polished leather as if to hold him in place, forcing him to witness his failure. In the farthest corner, half hidden behind a tree, stood a former student no one recognized at first. Olivia Barrett. The girl who had left Pine Valley in disgrace, expelled from school, marked as a failure. Eleanor had fought for her, pleaded with the school board, tried to reason with her parents. But it had been useless. Olivia had never seen her again, had never thanked her. Now, her face was a mask of stone, her fingers digging into the bark of the tree as she forced herself to watch. The rain had started to fall, slow and cold, streaking down her face like a silent rebuke. The priest's voice was steady as he read the final words, but it barely mattered. No one was listening. The sound of rain hitting the casket, soft at first, then more insistent, filled the silence between the mourners. The storm had arrived. As the first shovelful of dirt hit the polished wood, a sound escaped from someone in the crowd, a muffled sob, a sharp intake of breath. There was no turning back now. Eleanor Matthews was gone, and all that remained were the echoes of the past, the memories of unspoken gratitude, and the unbearable truth that it was too late to make amends. The usual sounds of Pine Valley's wilderness, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant hum of life, had vanished as if the world itself was holding its breath. The absence of sound made the gathering even more unbearable, stretching every second into something thick and unrelenting. The mourners shifted uneasily, their black-clad figures stark against the backdrop of the gray sky, the scent of rain-soaked earth thick in the air. The unease had begun subtly, a creeping sensation that made the skin prickle, an instinctive warning buried deep in the mind. But now, it had settled fully, pressing down on them like an invisible hand, making their breaths shallow, their movements hesitant. Something was wrong. The police chief, Alan Graves, stood rigid near the funeral director, a deep frown cutting into his weathered face. He had been to countless funerals in Pine Valley, seen grief take many forms, but this was different. The tension in the air wasn't the kind that came from sorrow alone. It was something else, something almost unnatural. He glanced at Robert Moore, the funeral director, and saw the same unease mirrored in the man's eyes. Moore's hands, always steady from years of working with the dead, now clenched at his sides. He had prepared Eleanor's body himself, handled every detail of the funeral, and yet standing here now in this charged silence, he felt a gnawing sense of dread deep in his gut. He had never felt this way before, not at any burial. The mourners weren't just grieving, they were afraid. Margaret Ellis's thin fingers twisted the damp tissue in her hands, her eyes flickering from face to face, as if searching for someone to confirm that they felt it too. Daniel Whitaker, his expensive suit now speckled with the fine mist of rain, swallowed hard, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Olivia Barrett, still half hidden behind the tree, pressed her back against the rough bark, her nails digging into the wood as if trying to ground herself against the creeping terror. The first handful of dirt had already been thrown onto the casket, but no one moved to follow. The priest hesitated, looking down at the waiting grave, then back at the crowd, his fingers tightening around the book in his hands. A gust of wind whipped through the clearing, cold and sharp, but it carried no sound, no rustling leaves, no distant whispers of movement through the trees. Just silence. Alan Graves cleared his throat, the noise startlingly loud in the quiet. "We should," he started, but his words cut off as a sharp crack echoed through the cemetery. The noise sent a jolt through the crowd, a collective flinch that spread through them like a ripple. Heads turned, eyes wide, searching. It had come from the casket. Robert Moore's breath caught in his throat. The polished wood, slick with rain, sat undisturbed in the earth. It hadn't moved. It was impossible. Yet the sound had been real. Margaret let out a quiet whimper, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. Daniel took an involuntary step back, his shoes sinking deeper into the wet soil. Olivia's grip on the tree tightened. The police chief squared his shoulders, forcing himself forward. It had to be the shifting ground. The rain. A trick of the mind. But then it happened again. Another crack, sharp and splintering, as if something beneath the earth was shifting, pushing against the weight of the soil. The silence shattered. Margaret let out a broken sob and stumbled backward. Someone in the crowd whispered a frantic prayer. Daniel turned sharply, looking as if he might run. Robert Moore took an unsteady breath, forcing logic over fear. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then the casket moved. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, barely enough to notice. But it was enough. The world tipped, the ground felt unsteady beneath them. Then came the whisper. Low, almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. A voice. Not from the mourners. Not from the trees. From below. A weak, rasping sound. A breath against the silence. "Help me." The words were barely more than a sigh, fragile and wrong. Margaret dropped to her knees, her sobs turning ragged. Daniel turned away, shaking his head over and over, his mouth opening in a soundless denial. Olivia pressed herself against the tree, her body rigid with terror. Robert Moore couldn't move. Alan Graves' hand hovered over his holster, as if a gun could do anything against something like this. Then, without warning, the casket shifted again, harder this time. The wood groaned. The grave dirt trembled. The storm broke above them with a deafening crash, thunder rolling through the valley like an unholy growl. Then, the silence was gone. A scream tore through the cemetery. And Eleanor Matthews' funeral was no longer just a funeral. The tension in the cemetery had already reached unbearable levels, but when the enormous grizzly bear emerged from the dense tree line, the fear became something primal. It was massive, towering. Its fur, thick and dark, was slick with rain, making it appear almost black in the storm's dim light. Its muscles rolled beneath its coat as it moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. Not wandering, not confused, but focused. The graveyard fell into complete, horrified stillness. The only sound was the steady drumming of the rain, the distant rumble of thunder, and the heavy, wet breath of the beast. Panic spread like wildfire. Margaret Ellis let out a strangled gasp, clutching at her chest as if trying to keep her heart from bursting. She stumbled backward, tripping over a loose mound of earth and landing hard on her knees, her wet dress clinging to her frail frame. She tried to scramble to her feet, but her limbs betrayed her, trembling with age and fear. Daniel Whitaker had no such hesitation. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, and he turned sharply on his heel, mud splattering up his pant legs as he took a step to run. But the sheer weight of terror made him freeze. It wasn't just the bear, it was where it was going. It wasn't looking at the people. It wasn't sniffing for food. It was heading straight for the coffin. The silence that had gripped the cemetery before now returned, but this time, it wasn't unnatural. It was pure, frozen horror. Alan Graves, the police chief, reached for his gun, his fingers curling around the grip, but he hesitated. What good was a gun against something like this? Against an animal so large, so certain in its movements? If he fired, he might only enrage it. He might doom them all. Robert Moore, the funeral director, stood rigid, his lips parted as if he might speak, but no words came. He had spent his life among the dead, had seen every possible expression of grief, but this was something else. Olivia Barrett, half hidden behind her tree, felt her body press so tightly against the bark that it bit into her spine. She wanted to disappear into it, to become nothing, to be anywhere but here. The bear reached the grave and stopped. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the heavy scent of wet fur and earth. The storm clouds thickened, swirling overhead as if mirroring the unease in the pit of every mourner's stomach. And then, the bear did something no one could have expected. It lowered its great head and sniffed at the casket. A deep, guttural sound rumbled from its chest, not a growl, not a roar, but something else. Something closer to mourning. The bear pressed one massive paw against the coffin's lid, its claws scraping faintly over the wood. The polished surface creaked under the weight, and for a brief, horrifying moment, it seemed as if it might splinter. Margaret let out a choked sob, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. Daniel took another shaky step backward. Robert Moore felt his breath catch in his throat, his instincts screaming that this was wrong, all of it was wrong. The bear stood there, its breathing heavy, its massive chest rising and falling. Its eyes, dark, intelligent, almost too human, stared down at the casket with something that could only be described as sorrow. And then came the whisper again. Faint. Desperate. Help me. It came from the coffin. Margaret crumpled completely, her sobs breaking through the rain. Daniel let out something between a whimper and a curse. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut, her nails carving crescent moons into the damp bark behind her. The bear didn't react with fear. It didn't flinch, didn't turn away. It pressed harder. The wood beneath its paw groaned. The mourners braced themselves for what they knew was coming, and yet none of them could move, could stop it. The lid cracked. A collective gasp shuddered through the cemetery as the coffin split slightly along the seam, a jagged fissure cutting through the polished veneer. Alan Graves took a step forward, but the bear turned its head sharply toward him, and he halted, his heart slamming against his ribs. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. The bear turned back to the casket. And then, with a final push, the lid snapped open. The silence that followed was unbearable. No one breathed. No one spoke. Margaret's body trembled violently as she forced herself to look, her vision swimming with rain and tears. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. Robert Moore had stopped blinking entirely, his wide eyes fixed on the impossible. The bear stepped back. And from inside the coffin, a hand emerged. Wrinkled. Fingernails caked with dirt. A hand that should not have been moving. A hand that should not have been alive. Margaret let out a sound that was more animal than human, her legs giving out completely. Daniel swore under his breath, taking several unsteady steps away. Olivia's entire body locked up, frozen in sheer disbelief. The hand clawed at the coffin's edges, weak but determined. The storm raged above them. And Eleanor Matthews began to rise. The bear stood motionless, its massive paw still pressed against the lid of the coffin. The deep, mournful sound it had released moments ago lingered in the air, sending shivers through the gathered mourners. Rain dripped from its thick fur, pooling in the deep grooves of its claws. It did not attack, did not retreat, only watched, waiting. Then the coffin moved. Not from the bear's pressure. On its own. A slow, unnatural shudder passed through the polished wood, like something shifting inside, something struggling against the weight of death itself. The creak that followed was agonizingly slow, a sound that slithered into the ears of everyone present, sending icy fingers of dread curling around their spines. Margaret Ellis let out a strangled gasp, her frail hands gripping the soaked fabric of her dress. Her body rocked slightly as if she might faint, but she stayed upright, barely. Daniel Whitaker stumbled backward, nearly falling, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. His polished shoes, once pristine, were now ruined with mud, but he didn't care. He couldn't. All he could do was stare at the coffin, at the bear, at the impossible. Robert Moore, the funeral director, felt his stomach twist. His hands, usually steady and precise, trembled at his sides. He had spent decades handling the dead, preparing bodies, making sure they were at peace before they were lowered into the earth. But this was something else. Something unnatural. Alan Graves, the police chief, kept his hand on his holster, though he knew instinctively that no bullet could stop whatever this was. His mouth was dry, his heartbeat a dull, pounding drum in his ears. He had spent his life enforcing the law, dealing with crime, with violence, with the worst humanity had to offer. But nothing, had ever made him feel as powerless as this moment. And Olivia Barrett, half hidden behind her tree, felt as if her lungs had turned to stone. She could not breathe, could not blink, could not comprehend what she was seeing. The coffin shuddered again, harder this time. The mourners recoiled, their bodies acting on instinct even when their minds refused to understand. The priest clutched his book tighter, his lips moving in a frantic whisper of prayer, though the words were lost beneath the wind and rain. The bear backed away, slow, deliberate, as if it had done what it came to do. It let out one final exhale, a sound too deep, too sorrowful, too knowing for an animal. Then it turned and disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the trees as quickly as it had emerged. But no one followed it with their eyes. No one could. Because at that moment, the coffin lid snapped open. The force sent it flying back, hitting the wet ground with a sickening thud. The mourners screamed. Some staggered away, others frozen in pure, unfiltered terror. The body inside the coffin moved. Margaret collapsed, her sobs uncontrollable now. Daniel let out a sound, half a curse, half a strangled breath, before stumbling further back, slipping on the wet grass. Robert Moore grabbed at his own arms, as if trying to hold himself together. His funeral home had seen many things, but never this. Never this. Alan Graves took a step forward, his gun still uselessly at his side, his mind unable to catch up to what his eyes were seeing. And Olivia, still gripping the tree, felt her nails dig into the bark so deeply that they split. Eleanor Matthews, dead, buried, mourned, was sitting up. Her frail hands, caked in dirt, gripped the edges of the coffin as if anchoring herself. Her skin was pale, almost gray beneath the rain, and her white burial gown clung to her like a second skin, soaked through with mud and water. Her face, oh, her face, was slack, empty, yet her eyes were wide, staring. Then, in a voice that sent ice crawling through every spine in the cemetery, she spoke. A whisper. A question. Why did you leave me? The words were hoarse, weak, yet they cut through the storm like a blade. No one answered. No one could. Because deep down, every single person at that funeral knew. Eleanor Matthews had been buried alive. The coffin jerked violently, sending another wave of horror crashing through the mourners. A deep, wet groan came from within, the sound of shifting wood and something worse, something alive. Think yes. Margaret Ellis let out a sharp, broken cry, scrambling backward through the mud on trembling hands and knees. Her dress, soaked and ruined, clung to her frail body, her thin arms shaking as she tried to push herself up. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere safe from the nightmare unfolding before them. Daniel Whitaker didn't hesitate this time. He turned and ran, his once composed businessman's demeanor shattered. His expensive shoes slipped in the wet grass, and he crashed hard onto his side, mud streaking across his face, his suit, his pride. He didn't stop. He clawed his way back up, panting, gasping, his breath coming in wild, frantic bursts as he fled. Robert Moore could not move. Could not breathe. His whole life had been dedicated to preparing the dead for rest. And now, standing before the impossible, his mind refused to accept what he was seeing. This wasn't how death worked. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to work. Alan Graves' grip on his gun tightened. His instincts screamed at him to act, to take control, but what could he possibly do? Arrest the dead? His years as a police officer had prepared him for violence, for tragedy, for human cruelty. But this was something else entirely. And Olivia Barrett, Olivia, who had spent years avoiding this town, who had returned only to face the weight of her past, stood frozen. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her nails still digging into the bark of the tree behind her. She had always thought of Eleanor Matthews as a ghost from her past. Now, she feared that ghost had come back to claim her. A few mourners bolted, their screams swallowed by the storm as they tripped and stumbled through the graveyard, desperate to escape. Others were too shocked to move, their bodies locked in place, their minds refusing to process what they were seeing. But not the bear. The enormous beast remained, standing firm, unaffected by the panic around it. Its dark eyes never left the coffin. It moved forward again, slow, deliberate. And then, to the horror of all who remained, it nudged the coffin gently with its snout. As if waiting. As if expecting something. The coffin jolted in response. A skeletal hand, pale and trembling, reached out from within, dirt still clinging beneath the fingernails. The fingers flexed weakly, grasping at the air, searching for something unseen. The arm that followed was thin, frail, wrapped in a burial gown now drenched and ruined by the storm. Margaret let out another strangled sob, pressing a shaking hand to her mouth. Robert Moore took an unsteady step forward, then stopped, his body betraying him. Alan Graves raised his gun, though what he thought it would do, he didn't know. And Eleanor Matthews sat up fully. Her movements were slow, unnatural, as if every muscle in her body had to remember what to do. Her wet hair clung to her face, her wide, unfocused eyes staring out at the terrified crowd. The wind howled through the trees. The storm raged above them. And then Eleanor's lips parted. She let out a rasping breath, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet cutting through the night like a blade. "Why did you leave me?" No one answered. Because deep down, they all knew, someone had buried Eleanor Matthews alive. The coffin lid hung open, rain pooling inside the dark wood as Eleanor Matthews slowly lifted a trembling hand. The mourners, those who had not fled, could do nothing but watch in horrified silence. The storm raged overhead, wind lashing through the trees, but none of it masked the sheer wrongness of the moment. Eleanor's frail fingers clutched something, a small leather pouch, dark and worn with age. Her other hand gripped the coffin's edge as if anchoring herself, her breath coming in slow, rattling gasps. Rain streamed down her hollowed cheeks, mixing with the dirt smeared across her once peaceful face. Margaret Ellis had collapsed onto the wet earth, unable to rise, her old body trembling with sobs she could not control. She had spent her life looking back at her mistakes, but never had she expected one of them to rise from the grave and stare her in the face. Daniel Whitaker had stopped running. He stood at a distance now, panting, his suit ruined, his once polished image reduced to nothing. He wanted to be gone, to pretend none of this was happening, but he could not tear his eyes away. Robert Moore, the funeral director, finally moved. His breath came in uneven bursts as he took an unsteady step closer. The rain-soaked ground squelched beneath his shoes, and he barely registered the cold seeping through his own clothes. He had handled Eleanor's body himself, had ensured she was at peace. He had failed her. Alan Graves had not lowered his gun, but his hands were no longer steady. He had seen many things in his time. Men at their worst, bodies left to rot in shallow graves, deaths that had come too soon, but this? The dead did not rise. The dead did not ask why they had been abandoned. And Olivia Barrett, still gripping her tree, could not breathe. She had spent her whole life trying to escape the past, and now it had climbed out of the ground before her. Eleanor moved again, her fingers tightening around the pouch as she pulled it closer to her chest. The rain softened for just a moment, the wind easing as if the world itself was waiting for what came next. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she pried open the pouch with her dirt-streaked fingers. Inside, nestled within the damp leather, was a single, folded piece of paper. The crowd held its breath. Eleanor's fingers shook as she pulled out the note, the edges curled from time and wear. Her lips, cracked and colorless, parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but could not find the strength. Instead, she let the note unfold in her hands. A sharp gust of wind threatened to tear it from her grip, but she held fast. The paper trembled in the storm, revealing the ink that had been carefully, lovingly pressed into it. It was a message. A final message. The words, though faded, were still legible. For my friend in the mountains, who walked with me in my final days. Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. Margaret let out a strangled gasp, her wrinkled hands pressing against her chest. Daniel's breath hitched, his mouth opening in shock. Robert Moore's lips parted, but no words came. Alan Graves felt his fingers go numb around his gun. And the bear, the great, towering beast that had emerged from the forest like a ghost, stood perfectly still. It had not come to attack. It had not come to threaten. It had come to return something. Eleanor's fingers curled tightly around the note, her breath shallow, uneven. The weight of the moment crushed down on those still standing in the graveyard, forcing them to face the truth. Eleanor had not been alone in her last moments. Someone had been with her. Someone had walked beside her as she faded from life. And that someone had not been human. The bear let out another deep, mournful sound, its eyes locked onto Eleanor's frail form. Then slowly, deliberately, it turned. With heavy, measured steps, it began to retreat, moving back toward the forest. It did not run. It did not hesitate. It only walked, disappearing once more into the darkness of the trees. The wind howled in its absence. The rain continued to fall. And Eleanor Matthews, pale and trembling, clutched the note to her chest as the truth settled over the stunned mourners. She had been left to die. But she had not died alone.